In the summer of 2001, inside the intelligence community, there was a phrase. The system was blinking red. There were warnings, streams of them, of an impending terrorist attack, threat reporting, chatter, fragments that, in hindsight, pointed into something big. But they weren't specific enough, not shareable enough to force action. And 9/11 happened. After the attacks, we rebuilt the system so we would never miss signals like that again. And we succeeded, mostly. Today, we don't miss signals. We're flooded by them, which means the problem has shifted from finding the signal to deciding what to do with it in time. That's the rewiring. And it's changing everything from national security to corporate cybersecurity to leadership itself. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues of intelligence, technology, and business. It's April 28th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Morning, Eric. I don't know why. It's been a really busy week. In fact, we're releasing this a day later than we normally do. I'm good, but man, time is screaming by. I don't know. Does it feel that way to you?
It does. It's almost May.
I know, craziness. So I'm good, moving along. That said, there are a couple things on my mind. One is these Lego videos
Yeah.
that Iran is putting out. I think there are a couple things. One is they're clever. They're kind of underlying terroristy, though, right? I mean, it's really good influence stuff. And we've been talking about influence for years. And that was fundamentally the whole issue about the 2016 election, was that Russia was trying to shape, not just interfere with the election infrastructure, but shape it. Well, this is unbelievable. So it's not quite the same thing. It's just these almost propaganda videos that are produced at speed that are just, I hate to say the word amazing because it makes me sound like I'm a fangirl of Iran, which is in fact, a malign regime. And we could talk about the legitimacy of the decision to do something about them versus what we actually did. But these things are catchy. They're modern. They create earwigs. It's hard to not watch the next one and laugh at it. And there is truth in it. And even they have evolved, right? Remember the first ones that came out were Lego war, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now they're kind of burrowing in. I think I read somewhere that the one that they put out after the brouhaha at the correspondence dinner was out within minutes, globally, shaped to influence the various regions to which they were deployed. In other words, what are they trying to get that region, say Japan, to think about the engagement? And I've said this, I think the most alarming thing that our choice of how we have acted in this has done is somehow we've made Iran a sympathetic actor in this play. And I think these videos are part of it. I don't have any metrics on their effectiveness, but just the acceleration in their release of them means that they must be thinking that there's value in it. And I'll also tell you it's costing them nothing, right?
Right.
They're AI generated. They got a bunch of folks. So that's one. It sounds like I'm marveling at it with admiration, but I just think it says, boy, the combination of technology distribution and kind of modern communications theory, we're seeing a case in it. And I would have to say, I think they're being effective. I think their marketing to Americans is better than our government's marketing to Americans. Yeah, just interesting. And then the other thing I'm watching is just a local story here in Austin that matters a bit to me, and that is the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation giving $1 billion to Austin and the growth and affecting of its Texas Innovation Health Center and the things that UT Health and Dell Medicine will do on everything from building a modern technical infrastructure for health, but also kind of breaking down the two-tier system of health for people with resources and the disparities of people without resources, and try and break that down and then revolutionize clinical care, and a lot of emphasis on cancer. And so pretty exciting in terms of that. A great example of what private investment and local purpose can do together. And I think the vision is big for it. It's almost like do something in Texas that is really important for Texas, but create a model that could be replicated nationally about how we integrate technology, data, infrastructure, research, and delivery of clinical services. So pretty exciting that Michael and Susan Dell did that.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. That's a very generous gift that's going to have long-standing impact. But back to your Team America World Police terrorist Lego, they are 100% terroristy videos.
They are, right? They are.
They are 110% propaganda videos, and they are even more percent probably effective. And I don't think it's bad at all to take a minute and marvel at the effectiveness and especially the return on investment from how much it costs them, right? It reminded me talking before about how cheap those Houthi drones are and how many millions of dollars we have to pay to combat those. They're just putting these out in the space, and to tailor them to the distinctive markets around the world to affect some of that international sentiment, the new propaganda model in 2026.
One, I'll bet people are clicking and opening them. And two, we've talked about this before. The foundation of free and open societies is a default to trust. These are pretty clever about opening that gap even wider. There was one that was like We the People that is basically saying, we love you, America. There are people doing things in your name. And I just think the cleverness of attacking us right in our value system is just a deep understanding of who we are. Anyway, really interesting. I just feel like a paid political announcement that I have to say. We've talked about differences that I think about the likelihood of success of some of the approaches we're taking so far. Man, I hope we bring this to a close and that we get some sort of agreement that allows global economics to stabilize. And I know you must feel the same way I do. As I would hate if we had to take this to a hot war, because sending folks into harm's way is always a tough choice.
What are we talking about today?
We're going to continue our rewiring theme, but we're not going to be so explicit about that. We're going to talk about what was alluded to in your cold opening, which is the new failure mode, which is not missing the warning, but seeing it and still not moving fast enough to matter. We kind of have said this explicitly. The most consequential security threats in 2026 aren't the ones that look like attacks. They're the ones that look like normal activity. A streaming box on your shelf, an API query to an AI model, or a bet placed on a prediction market, the perimeter is gone. And now the question isn't whether adversaries can get in, it's whether you notice them if they're already there. And our whole systems has been predicated on the idea of protection, right? This is now moving so fast on every front that there are two big questions that we have. One is, we're seeing it all, but who's supposed to do something about it, even if you do it? And the second is, how do we move from systems that try and keep bad things from happening to systems that are able to still function when you discover that you were wrong about whether you could keep it out or not? So in addition to who's responsible for doing something about things when we see them, there's also the question of how we change our whole security infrastructure, one from prevention to resilience. And we've been talking about it and technologies are moving along, but you and I understand this really well. We love solving problems by the pound. We set up a program of how long it's going to take to get all the things in place that we need, and we budget for them over several years, and then it takes longer than several years because we don't have the money to do it. Well, the stories we're going to talk about today say, no, it's here. And so all those best laid plans of how we were going to make our systems be able to be safe and secure, it's like we've got to change the mindset and revamp a model in minutes. So really interesting about when we talk geopolitically about rewiring, we also have to rewire how we assure ourselves that we are able to thrive and operate in the way that we want to be able to in a world that is moving faster than the normal signal response. You're going to have to prepare for signals you didn't protect and be able to ensure survival anyway. So That's what we're going to talk about today with some pretty specific examples. So lead us through them, oh wise one.
All right, let's get to it. So a $400 streaming device called Superbox, previously sold at Best Buy, Walmart, Amazon, and Newegg, promises access to over 2,200 plus live channels, but requires users to replace the Google Play Store with an unofficial app store that immediately phones home to China's Tencent QQ servers and enrolls the device in a proxy network called Grass.io. When we talk about threats that are already inside the perimeter, this is literally plugged into someone's home router or connected to their Wi-Fi network. How do you think about the difference between a nation state exploiting a vulnerability versus selling you the vulnerability at a big box retailer for $400, Sue?
Yeah, let me just say, I was listening to that anew. Like, I knew what you were going to say. I'm still like, this is, I feel like I'm in my admiration mode. This is clever, right? It's by design. It's not vulnerability. The product is the exploit.
Hmm.
They're basically selling us the exploit. And it's almost like a Tesla, right? It looks like a car, but it's really software. This looks like a product, but it's really an exploit being used. So your question is great about what's the difference between a nation state and this? And the answer is it's not really different from a nation state. And I think this is one of the still lagging understandings that we have in the nation is all the things we're able to do, all the things that we trust, in fact, because we've been a nation of laws. There's a separation between government and the private sector. The Constitution was written to limit the government's ability, not to give the people rights. And so our whole society, just how we think of things is, I go to Best Buy and I buy something. Of course it wouldn't be completely exploiting everything that I have. That is not true in some of these more authoritarian regimes that we are now digitally connected to, and they seem like us, but what their governing theory of the case is, and ours is entirely different. And so think about China. China's national security laws say that any Chinese product or Chinese citizen must turn over the data if asked. I mean, that's their law says that they have to be able to. And so that's one of the biggest things that they are using and we as citizens are missing is that environment that allowed us to go to Best Buy and buy something and think that somebody was taking care of it being secure is just obliterated. And what happens when you get this sort of distribution, and in this case, distribution is the breakthrough, having sat doing cyber intelligence, the difference here is we did onesie and twosie things. You're talking about hundreds of millions of things when you get to that number. So distribution is really the breakthrough here more than the exploit is. I think for our listeners, the effect of all this is these products are bypassing the entire consent to architecture that we presume is in place, and it just steps around it. It says, yeah, you used to have all these things that would control it. We're just going to step around it, and it's going to look like the same functionality, but all those things you presume are there aren't there anymore.
Yeah, and so that consent, right? How is this different from normal digital marketing that we have today? So every time you visit a website, small pieces of code called tracking pixels, which are those tiny invisible images embedded on the web page, they fire a signal back to the company that placed them. And that signal allows the company to see the person who visited the page, at what time, and through their IP address, what device and in what location. Then you've got Facebook, Google, Amazon, and thousands of ad networks. Each have their own pixels running across millions of websites, which is why you search for hiking boots one time and then see ads for them everywhere for the foreseeable future. And then cookies are the mechanism that makes that persistent. When you visit a site, it drops a small file onto your computer, a cookie, that acts like a name tag. And now every subsequent site you visit that runs the same ad network recognizes you. Your browsing history across dozens of unrelated websites gets stitched together into a single behavioral profile. And here's the part people forget. We agreed to all this, and that accept cookies banner is only the tip of the iceberg. Layer 1 is consenting into your operating system, iOS or Windows or what have you. Layer 2 is your accounts, so like Facebook, Gmail, etc. And then layer 3 is the apps, many of which don't work unless you opt into location services and all those other things. And then layer 4, the last one, is actually the cookies. So even if you were to go on a website and from now on set a policy of I'm going to deny all cookies, that's like locking your screen door after you've already handed out the keys to the house. It's not meaningless, but it addresses maybe 10% of the tracking picture. That's what makes this Superbox comparison so useful, because even in our current system, there is a consent architecture. It's confusing. It's 40 pages of terms and conditions that many people don't actually read, but Superbox does not have that consent layer. There's no opt-in. The box just starts collecting as soon as you plug it in. So what can individuals do? Because Sue, you mentioned sold at Best Buy, but that's not a security certification.
This is a really hard problem, and I hate that you and I are doing really good problem identifying today more than problem solving. I will say, and we've said, everyone is either the target or the transportation in a digital world. The threat surface is everywhere. Our adversaries and competitors, just like marketers, are figuring out how to use that and use the convenience we prefer and use our habituation and use the we don't think anyone cares about me so that I can do whatever I want. They're figuring out how to use this. So this is like that moment where there's a design feature that we put in place and now it's being used in ways we don't like. But there are things you can do. Just like for individuals, we always say use two-factor identification, make sure that you've got the most up-to-date cybersecurity. In this case, there are things you can do. Check your router's connected devices list. I know it sounds like I don't want to have to do that. I'm not technical. This is really simple to do. If you're using any of the Chat GPTs or Claudes or any of the open products, you can even ask how to do that. Simple query of one of these LLMs is to say, how do I check my router's connected devices list? You can ask it, right? What am I seeing that's a cheap off brand that doesn't look like something? So look what the things are connecting to. Stick to known ecosystems. The truth is big things like Apple and Roku and Amazon and Google Chromecast, people with a big market don't want to have their brand be corrupted. So they have more money, more resources. They tend to be more trusted. They don't want to be corrupted. They don't want theft going through it. So stick to some known brands rather than some of the off-product stuff. And then treat your home network like a perimeter. Just think about you wouldn't let anyone come into your house, stranger danger. If you have to use an unknown device, try and put it on a guest network. And again, there are some really good ways. I do it all the time. How do I cast something from my phone onto my TV? Not being technical is not an excuse to do these things. Take the list, stick to known ecosystems, check your router's connected device, treat your home as though it's sacrosanct, and look for things that don't look right. And it seems hard, but I know you can do it. Before we go on to the next segment, though, in the news is also Anthropic's Mythos, a really new, powerful tool that they've put off distribution because it was discovered that it could be used to find vulnerabilities at scale and speed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And what that means is it used to be that over time, a hole in a program would be found and it could be exploited to get into the network and do nefarious things, from intellectual property theft to actually damaging networks and ultimately at some point being able to shut off capabilities. This is now a vulnerability that would say, hey, can I ask a question that says, tell me all the vulnerabilities and continuously employ them? Again, we caught it in time in a way to be able to not just put it on the market for everyone to have it when we couldn't control it. But boy, it's a signal of the future, right? If you just think about the arc of history and how we think about both consent and protection, it used to be that important technologies that we knew were problematic were initiated by the government, and so we built a consent and a protection schema around it before it was released into the wild. Now, so much of what we're using is bypassing that, and how do you deal with it after it's out at scale and volume? It just means that we're going to have to do more things faster but sign of the times, be watching for it.
Yep. And if you figure that the Chinese models are a couple months, maybe a year behind some of the development that's happening in the US, and we'll talk a little bit about how they're accessing some of those models. If Anthropic just came out with Mythos, it's only a matter of time before there's another product out there.
If you want to understand what's problematic about this, it's the reason why in the US we constrain government is because it's all fun and games for an advertiser to be able to try and sell me a product. It's quite another. We don't like the government with all its power to be able to do things. And so we've got all these laws that keep the US government from being able to do these things. Foreign governments have figured out, oh, we can use our power and get in, and they'll let us in, right? So this juxtaposition between what we're allowing ourselves to do and what is being done to us using our legal framework is really fascinating. We're going to have to work together much better than we do between the government and the private sector, because neither one can do the job alone. And citizens, open your eyes.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's real. And I don't think the opt-in is going to change, right? We've traded off security for speed in some cases.
That consent is again used by these people because what we would typically say, well, I didn't consent to that. Where's the accountability going to come? In the US system, your consent means you consented because we believe in the power of the individual. You think our adversaries and competitors don't understand that about us? And they've now created this largely unaccountable system where you can't go back and get damages for something you've done. It's rewiring. It's creating an entirely new system that bypasses the system that was the governor on bad actors and bad actions. And I don't think that more regulation from government down in the way that we've implemented can't catch up to the
Mhm.
distribution of new ways to be attacked. We're going to have to be cleverer about what the asymmetric response to this kind of threat is. The system that is now in place is doing what it does. There is nothing inherently evil in that. It's just that we had set up an expectation that we could put some friction against that to stop the bad use. And those two things are now completely out of whack, where one is just a flywheel that's moving so fast, doing what it does that is not inherently evil, but it is yielding unintended consequences that we increasingly can't counter.
Those are some of the threats at the individual level. And now we're going to talk about what's happening more at the enterprise level and some of that government private sector collaboration you were talking about. On April 23rd, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a formal memorandum, NSTM Tech 4, to the heads of every executive department and agency with a blunt subject line: adversarial distillation of American AI models. The memo states that the U.S. government has information that foreign entities, principally based in China, are running deliberate industrial scale campaigns to distill American frontier AI systems using tens of thousands of proxy accounts to evade detection and jailbreaking techniques to extract proprietary capabilities. The administration's response outlines 4 commitments. 1. Sharing threat intelligence with U.S. AI companies about the tactics and actors involved. 2. Enabling private sector coordination. 3. Developing joint best practices to detect and mitigate distillation campaigns. And 4. Exploring measures to hold foreign actors accountable. The OSTP memo is essentially the government saying out loud, China is stealing our AI through the front door at industrial scale, and we need the private sector's help to stop it. So you've been in these rooms when the White House issues something like this to all agency heads. What does that actually set in motion?
So it's interesting. I think this is another example of where this administration is, addressing issues that need to be addressed. And these 4 areas, I think, are 100% accurate. And I'm glad they're saying it out loud. But there's just a huge gap between even a policy, and this isn't a policy even yet, but there's a huge gap, even if it were a policy, between policy and implementation. Somebody's got to do something about it. Someone's got to spend money in order to affect it, and it's just not clear. So I'll refer to the previous conversation just in a different domain. This time we know it's the Chinese government. We know it's being had, and we're now giving some guidance on what needs to be done. I'm going to be simple about how I want to answer this one. And that is, we have done this before. We've said this before. Yes, the U.S. government needs to share intelligence with AI companies. Yes, we need to enable their coordination. Yes, we need to develop joint best practices to detect and mitigate. And yes, we need to exploit measures. Here's the deal. If we did all these things, we would still do them in series, right? We would do them one after another. Well, what are we going to share? How much do we share? What do we need to do? Think of those 4 areas as 4 circles in a Venn diagram. And right now we're pursuing them as though it's a linear system that these things have to happen in some sort of order. No, we've got to figure out how to do that together. And there are models out there. Actually, this is an area where the UK has done a really good job, that they have a much tighter relationship between the government and the private sector. And their AI Security Institute, AISI, is doing some really interesting things on this front. They have a different legal framework that allows them to do things between companies and government. Like, it's cool to say that the government doesn't affect the private sector. That's just hogwash. We're in this together. And so the biggest thing is those things have to happen, not each one of the entities protecting what it does and then telling the other group. So the government says, I'll decide how much I want to share, but you, private sector, have got to do a better job developing things. No, the government's got to say, how much do I need to share so that you can understand intent, so that you can develop practices that are consistent with your values. Just think about all these things we need to do instead of being done in the way each of us prefer to do it. Now we've got to say, let's bounce up. We need to achieve this outcome. All these things have to happen, but they can't be done with only the interests of one party in mind. I will say that we're talking about it within the U.S. and with the private sector. This is the same thing we're going to have to do globally with allies and partners. And that is, historically, the U.S. has said, here's what needs to happen for good. We will tell you how you will do it according to our standards and our preferences of implementation. That world is just gone, right? Because in free and open societies, we have so much diversity in the way things are implemented that if everyone gets to protect their own and has to listen to somebody else, we just don't close. So in these areas, this is a great example of, we know what needs to happen. The problem is we have to each imagine trusting the other one to give each sector what it needs to do its job, rather than I get to do my way and you're responsible for you doing your stuff better. Aunt Sue says, you will see a real change when we actually can imagine having common values with enough sharing of information so that each party can do what it needs to do based on what the other entity has given it. But that's a redesign.
Yeah. And that's the government side, but also in a timely sequence of events, we got some news on the private sector side. Strider Technologies, a Utah-based firm, was profiled in Bloomberg just over this weekend. We've talked about Strider before on this program and what they're doing in OSINT, building what they call a, quote, digital twin of the industrial world down to the personal level. It's a platform that ingests billions of publicly available documents, corporate registries, trade records, foreign language filings, to map the networks that state actors use to acquire foreign technology, place insiders, and obscure ownership. So in a live demo, Bloomberg watched the platform map roughly 33,000 semiconductor shipments worth $240 million that reached Russian and Iranian drone programs despite post-2022 sanctions, identifying diversion routes through Shenzhen and Hong Kong in about 2 minutes and a compute cost of less than $20. So this is the commercialization of counterespionage. What used to be an exclusively government function, classified and unshared, is now available to any organization. And the reason that matters for this episode is the gap it fills. As OSTP's memo acknowledges, the government can identify the threat, but it needs the private sector to detect in real time across their networks, supply chain, and personnel. So, Sue, who is responsible?
Who is responsible?
Both together. First, kudos to Strider on this. It is a great example of, by living outside of the kind of very controlled government environment, it has figured out that the world has a whole bunch of information that isn't locked away in safes, and it has figured out a way to, in their case, exploit it for good. We talk a lot about the exploitation of this environment for nefarious reasons. This is a good example of exactly that same energy being applied to solving a problem that happens. I am so excited about what it portends in terms of how the world's data can be used and what the commercial sector is developing. This is a great example of an incredible view into the power of using. We've talked about hunter and gatherer. The way we thought about intelligence in the past was there was rare piece of information that were hard to get to, and we'd go hunt for those pieces of information. And if I got them, I would protect them as a secret, and I would know more than anyone else. Increasingly, value is, how's it all working? And if you can collect all the data, you're going to be able to see the patterns. And that's incredibly powerful, and the private sector is showing how to do it. I think in this instance, and in many instances, the private sector is offering its capabilities. And the bigger challenge is, how does a government accept that, not cross its own fourth wall of using it against American entities, because that's where our laws preclude it, and only using it in order to protect it. What's interesting about Strider showing it to Bloomberg is, if we could get the private sector to understand that it bears responsibility for security as well, this is a tool that companies can use to do their part to protect themselves by seeing what's happening and make some choices about what they do and don't do. So, great tool in the commercial ecosystem that commercial entities who are actually responsible for security because of the global connectedness can use these tools. And I would encourage people to realize, again, there are now products that they can use to see what's happening to them and that do a better job of their responsibility for protecting what can be used nefariously. Increasingly, there are capabilities like Striders that could be used by the government to think of how we close that Venn diagram and share more information and have a faster turn and allow more entities to make their own decisions about what to do because they understand risk better than the aggregate does. But we've got to find a way to share it and make it accessible and make it easy and signal that we want that to happen. And so the answer is, everyone's responsible, but no one can do all of it by themselves. And each one, if they just solve their narrow problem, won't get us to an environment that allows the vibrance that history has shown we have when we can default to trust.
Well, let's move on to some of the prediction markets now. Last week, U.S. Army Special Forces Master Sergeant Van Dyke was arrested and charged with wire fraud for allegedly using classified information about the planned January 3rd raid to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro to place bets on Polymarket. Van Dyke became involved in planning the operation in early December. By December 24th, allegedly, he was trying to open an account on Kalshi, a CFTC-regulated prediction market, which blocked him. Sue, what is the CFTC?
Eric, I rely on you for this, but I'm going to give it a try. So the CFTC is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. It's a federal agency that most people have never heard of. It was created in the 1970s to regulate futures markets, originally things like corn and wheat and oil, and farmers and commodity buyers needed a way to lock in prices ahead of time, and the CFTC existed to make sure those markets were fair and transparent. We've talked about this before. Think about government, repeatable, transparent, and fair, and CFTC was one of those things that was put in place to help markets be that. Now, over the decades, the jurisdiction expanded to cover more complex financial instruments, derivatives, options, everything, while you're essentially placing a contract on the future value or outcome of something. So the world changed. It expanded to help the financial markets, especially as those became more individually traded. And that's the door prediction markets walked through. Kalshi and Polymarket argue that their contracts aren't gambling, they're financial instruments, just like betting on the future price of oil. And if the prediction markets are gambling, then every state gets to regulate them, from licenses to taxing restrictions and the works. So what's interesting is, like so many things, what started a good idea in an environment that was relatively controlled to what the government was trying to provide as essentially something that was repeatable, transparent, and fair, has just exploded into a world that was never envisioned at that time. And it's hard for us to achieve that same control while still being consistent to our values that typically try and permit, but responsible to our society, which is we don't want bad things to happen to you. So I think that's the tension that we're feeling there. How'd I do?
That was great. So he was unable to open the Kalshi account, and then Sergeant Van Dyke allegedly opened a Polymarket account on December 27th instead. In the week leading up to the raid, he placed more than a dozen bets totaling about $33,000 on contracts asking whether U.S. forces would be in Venezuela by January 31st and whether Maduro would be out of office. In March, the New York Times analyzed Polymarket data around the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran and found a massive surge in last-minute bets the day before the attack. Over the course of a single Friday, more than 150 accounts placed hundreds of bets of at least $1,000 correctly predicting an American strike by Saturday, totaling roughly $855,000 in 11th-hour wages. Earlier in February, Israeli authorities had already arrested several people for using insider information from their roles in the military to place bets on operations. So the CFTC actually prohibits markets related to war, but Polymarket listed its Iran contracts on its offshore platform, which bars U.S. customers, at least officially. Bets are made in cryptocurrency on anonymous wallets, and it's nearly impossible to identify who's behind the accounts. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is trying to keep these at the national level and governed as futures. In April, the CFTC filed lawsuits against 3 states, Illinois, Connecticut, and Arizona, arguing that prediction markets are federally regulated financial instruments and that states have no authority to regulate them as gambling. And finally, the same week, Kalshi revealed it had fined and suspended 1 Senate candidate and 2 House candidates for betting on their own campaigns. And Senator Bernie Moreno introduced a bill to bar senators from trading on prediction markets at all. And by fined, it was like in the low thousands of dollars for the Senate candidate and a couple $100 for the House candidates. So, Sue, wasn't betting on yourself the reason that Pete Rose wasn't in the Baseball Hall of Fame? So how do you see this?
This is just a great example of a good idea that works when and then the environment explodes and you're struggling. The system that exists is trying to do what it's supposed to do, which is not let people nefariously, individually game in a way that isn't helpful. Yes, the federal government is trying to tell the states that it can't do certain things, except in other instances, the federal government is telling the states that it's responsible, right? And where's that line between the difference? So the problem is, number one, with the technology that exists, markets are becoming intelligence services. The amount of data that can now be put together for use, patterns that can be understood, that create opportunities for both good, depending on who you are, and bad effect at volume, are just, again, outstripping our ability to keep it from being used. The problem is, where's the repeatable, transparent, and fair action against the people that are misusing them? So we talked in previous examples about one of the things that's happening because of the inability of structures that were set up to govern, not being able to govern at volume, is who do you decide to prosecute? Who has privilege? Who is it good for? Who do you allow? Who do you disallow? And who's the adjudicator of what you go against? So the problem I see is the technology and the opportunity of a digital world have allowed information to be exploited at a speed and volume that we didn't expect. So there are a couple problems. The anonymity breaks accountability. If you can't see who's betting, you can't see who's leaking, so you don't have any attribution. If you don't have attribution, you don't have deterrence. And regulatory frameworks just weren't built for this. So on the one hand, we can't do anything about it. On the other hand, we can't do things about it individually. On the other hand, do we now have three hands? How do you decide which of those individual problems that you affect? And then finally, is it a states thing or is it not a states thing? And so the problem that we have is in the great rewiring that we're talking about, you can't slow it down. There are these second and third order effects that are in place where individuals with no broader responsibility than getting what they want to have are able to do what they can for themselves. But the question is, who's doing the big things to make sure that the system is still repeatable, transparent, and fair? And sometimes the government benefits in prohibiting individuals. Well, how's that going to work if the tech is developed outside the government? So I both see the point of I'm just betting on myself. Isn't that okay? Well, on the one hand, that always has been okay. On the other hand, now when you act for yourself, if everyone's acting for themselves, you're destroying the framework that allows societies, or particularly free and open societies, to govern. So to me, this is a perfect example of a good idea in the past that isn't the wrong idea. It's just the wrong implementation given that the environment has obliterated.
Yeah, if you take the free market idea of it, why don't you just put a blue check mark next to the actual counts and you can say, oh, hey, this White House intern is betting that the strike is going to happen on Saturday. I wonder what's going to happen. Other people are probably not going to bet against them because they are suspected to have insider information. Does that help wash it out? Or where do you draw the line of someone who has decision-making authority in the government can't make one of these bets, but someone who works in the government can? What do you think?
And don't we want the government to be able to look at the same things? Because again, who's responsible for national security? Yeah, so as you were just describing it, Eric, I love that from an individual perspective. And from the blue check mark, I love being able to see who's doing what, so again, I can make better decisions. But wait, the second you flip that around to shouldn't the government be able to do that so it can protect the populace? Well, I don't know. Now, is it manipulating what we believe in as a free market system in a manner that will not yield the outcome we want? And I think that's the rub. We have historically had an environment where we want individuals to thrive. That's the capitalism piece of it. And we want a society that kind of has a fair playbook where we can huddle together for warmth, and we have a government that offers some protection against those who would manipulate individuals. That idea is wonderful, but one side of that equation is moving at speed, the capitalism side, and one side is not responding. And the answer is because this idea of separation is impeding development of good solutions. But too much unity turns us into an autocracy. And I think that's playing out in so many different domains. And we've got to, Eric, you and I have got to get down to a segment where we actually offer 5 actions that would help us close. But this episode to me has been a great demonstration of areas where you're seeing this difficulty of a system out of control without a system being able to keep up. And we wanted both those systems to be working in concert. And we've just, not because of evilness, not because of nefariousness, it's because an environment changed and the system couldn't keep up. So if we think back to try and bring this to a little bit of a close, over the whole episode, our 3-line is the threat is already inside the wire. And in some cases, it's what we want to have versus what we want to be able to assure. And the perimeter model is dead, whether that is from physically with a digital environment that just connects it all, to intellectually that there just isn't a separation between the individual, the company, and the government. How do we get them back to working in concert? But in 2026 and beyond, we have to presume that inside our perimeter, all these forces are doing the things for themselves, and some of them create threats. And how are we going to not just prevent it, but account for that environment? So to me, that's a kind of Sue framework. We started with Eric's framework on how to think of it. this is the Sue framework, is how the intelligence community evolved post 9/11 from keep them out to assume they're in and find them faster. And so this is where all the three segments of this episode kind of land in the same place. A streaming box that looks like a consumer product but works for a foreign intelligence service, an AI distillation campaign that looks like normal API access. In other words, we designed the system to do how it's being used, but it's industrial scale theft. And a prediction market that looks like Smart Wager but is built on classified information about a military operation. And in every case, the threat used the front door. In many cases, it's our adversaries that had a better understanding of our legal framework and just is using it against us. The system we built for convenience, for openness, for innovation was the attack surface. And so the perimeter is gone. And the question is whether they can get it. It's whether you notice when they're already there. The question is, what are we going to build and who's going to do it? And I think you and I ought to challenge ourselves to put an offer on the table.
All right. Game on. What else you watching?
All these cyber stories, all the stories that you talked about, they're all unfolding in real time. And I think we ought to watch where they go. One we haven't really talked about is nation states. Iran is actually trying to penetrate critical infrastructure. Again, what's interesting about doing that from their perspective is our infrastructure is so distributed that it is both equally hard to protect and equally hard to attack at scale. But the intention is certainly there. And so all this stuff, whether it's mythos and how we're going to end up trying to protect against that reality when we don't really have the tools already in place, I think is interesting. I do think what's interesting in the stories about mythos is the private sector is really jumping on this because they recognize that it is a threat to their operating model. So I think that's one of the good things that happens here. The other thing I'm watching is there's a new number one artist in, I think, Apple Music named Inga Rose, who has a number one hit called Celebrate Me. And I've listened to it and it's catchy. And there is no human Inga Rose. It's a total AI fabrication. And it's producing hit records. And so what do we think about that?
Wow.
I know. What do we think about it? On the one hand, duh, right? There's so much science around, much like everything we've talked about in this episode, about what's pleasing to the ear, what creates an earworm that gets in your head, what's pretty, what's pleasing. I think where the opportunity is, yeah, but does it create masterpieces? And are masterpieces because of vocal imperfection? No one would say that Elton John, yes, Sienna, that's for you. No one would say that Elton John has the best voice, but boy, you have to listen to his music and his song, in part because it is different and unique. So there's nothing wrong with pretty. I think we shouldn't shake our fists at the fact that it can be done, but I think we should also recognize that I'm not sure that it's not stealing our soul if we don't also recognize what's beautiful about individual and imperfect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially on music, because that's just math. And to your point about the classics persisting, right? Will AI make something like Beethoven's Fifth that will continue for hundreds of years? Or is it going to be the song of the summer replayed a little bit later and you see it only on VH1's back in the 2020s?
Yeah.
This song was popular. You know?
I mean, I think it's a real question. And again, I don't think we get the simplicity of hating it, right? But is it enough? And if I go down my everything is everything, remember when we were talking about private equity buying up farms? On the one hand, it infuses money into a discipline that needs money in order to continue to advance to provide the food that we need to consume. On the other hand, when you separate it from the locality, when the business isn't tied to the people that live there and the community that is supported by it, is it persistent or is it just delivering an outcome? And you can't choose one or the other because we need both. We've just lost the ability to do both together. And that's where I think the innovation that this moment demands that we're not talking enough about.
Yep.
What are you watching?
I'm watching the Fed meeting this week. I don't know what's going on. None of this makes sense. Something happens, escalates in Iran. You think things are going down. The market goes up. We're almost at 25,000 on the NASDAQ. It seems like the 10-year Treasury is more responsive to CPI data than even interest rates and geopolitical events right now. So it's just tough to be an economist these days, but interested to see what the Fed decides to do and what happens with reactions to that.
Yeah, great what you're watching. I didn't mention Iran for the same reason. It's hard to understand what these things are going on, but with the Fed and the market and why are things behaving the way they are, even though we know that they could have it, I think this is, again, one of those kind of the world is still in the individual. It's working out fine for me, so it must be okay. But a little bit like our budget episode of last week, yeah, but what we're losing as a collective is to do the big things that we all count on that has allowed all this individual game. So I think that's the issue. It's doing fine because all of us say, well, I'm okay. My companies are doing all right. But if we're not behaving in a way that allows the system to persist over time, there is a time at which those individual actions will not aggregate to enough goodness.
Yep. Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. And thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear what you think of our direction, focus, and insights. It's the conversation we want, even more than any adulation you might offer, though we like that too. Tell us how we can better serve you because we are, in fact, here for you. Join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sake, be kind to one another. It makes all the difference.